and thank you for joining us at the Observer Research Foundation's Fellows Seminar, which we hold fairly regularly to discuss some of the work that our fellows are doing in our three centers in Delhi, Bombay, and Calcutta on various issues related to their academic work. Today we've got a very interesting paper that I'm looking forward to listening to from our fellow in our Bombay, in our Mumbai center, Aditi Ratho, on gender responsive budgeting, and in particular comparison between India, Rwanda, and Bangladesh in terms of the impact and effectiveness of gender response budgeting. And we're very happy and very glad that we have two other discussants who will be will be essentially talking about Aditi's paper. I can see Kadambari is with us, so Kadambari Shah of IDFC Institute, and Shoumeli will also join us a little later. The way that we're going to structure this is that Aditi will first speak for a while, make her presentation. I will then turn to the two discussants, introduce them, and introduce them individually, and give them some time to speak. And then we will turn to Q&A from the audience. At that point, or from those of you listening in, at that point, I'll let you know how that should be done. So thank you. Aditi, if you could.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mihir. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. To start off, gender responsive budgeting is a targeted fiscal instrument that several developing countries have cemented into their growth plans. It's used to ensure that policy prescriptions to alleviate gender inequality translate into outputs by linking them to budgetary allocations. This paper analyzes the differences in approaching a gender budgeting framework and the extent of its inclusion in the planning process in the three countries mentioned. It also compares them through the Gender Gap Index, the Gender Inequality Index, and Human Development Index, and finally compares observations from all three countries that can be incorporated to improve the efficacy of GRB. So the reason Rwanda and Bangladesh was chosen in particular to be compared with India is that if you look at reports and indicators like the Gender Gap Index, which measures the extent of gender-based gaps through health, education, economy, and political parameters, countries with GRB efforts where ministries actually assess sectors of the economy in which women could participate more productively, identify the constraints to participation, and then develop fiscal policies are better equipped to spend money on the indicators that can help close these gender gaps. So countries in which the GRB process actually leads to budgets being allocated should perform better in gender equality reports and indexes, as opposed to countries where the GRB process merely quantifies how much of the budget benefits women. It's hard to create a causal link between bridging gender gap and GRB processes, as we will see once we compare the frameworks in India, for example, where the GRB process is still limited and budgeting by itself is not the strongest tool to deliver gender justice anyway. So when we talk about these indexes, Bangladesh has been the best performing country in South Asia, which you can see in the table on the left, and India is fourth in the region. And in the table on the right, you can see that in Sub-Saharan Africa, Rwanda has been the best performing country by far. So since Bangladesh and Rwanda have achieved such a good level of closing their gender gap in their regions, it would be good to delve further into their well-established GRB structures as well. So according to the 2020 GGI report, the Gender Gap Index report, the most significant gender disparity has remained in the political empowerment gap. However, Rwanda and Bangladesh seem to have done pretty well on this front. If you can see on the table, sorry, this one. If you can see on the table on the right, Rwanda ranks 4 and Bangladesh 7 respectively, with India not too far behind at 18. All three countries have also performed their best in these indicators. The Human Development Index ranks all the countries based on the quantification of factors like life expectancy, expected mean years of schooling, and gross national income per capita. And the gender segregation of the HDI reveals quite a bit. As you saw in the previous table, the GGI showed Rwanda to be leading and India lagging. But here you can see in the HDI, Rwanda falls behind both India and Bangladesh. But if you see the gender segregated HDI, it reveals that this is due to Rwanda's low ranking for both male and female HDI. India and Bangladesh have a larger disparity between men and women. So this is why Rwanda performs better in the gender-based indicators like the Gender Development Index and the Gender Inequality Index. So this is important to note because the gender gap and gender disparity is also something that needs to be considered when talking about overall development. So the gender segregated data for employment and education in the HDI shows why the countries are where they rank in the GGI. Rwanda performs the best in female labor force participation, employment of women in management positions, share of seats held by women in parliament, and the total unemployment rate, and only lags behind in the youth unemployment rate. Bangladesh performs well in the share of seats held by women in parliament and labor force participation rate, and the only indicator India leads in is the youth unemployment rate, which shows why it lags behind the other two countries in the GGI. So as you can see, women's access to education in India is actually far better than in Bangladesh and Rwanda. But clearly this is not translated into employment as well as it has in the other countries. So this is definitely a sector to take into consideration when thinking of budgeting and policy making. Now to see the frameworks in the three countries and see if it even allows for us to make any kind of claim for there to be a link between indicator and processes. In India, the gender responsive budgeting process was only cemented in the 2005-2006 financial year, where all ministries and departments had to provide a note on GRB as part of the budget circular that would reflect gender allocations in two formats. Part A, where the schemes under the ministry or the department that specifically target women with 100% of the budget allocation, or 30%, which is part B of the scheme. And this is the form in which they have to fill in these values. And in 2013, the Ministry of Women and Child Development issued guidelines to all the states and union territories that all of them must provide an overview and timeline of the gender budgeting process. And every year, the gender budget is released with the union budget in the expenditure section, where which gives an overview of all the ministries and states that have allocated funds for not just the gender budget, but also the welfare of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, children, etc. So vulnerable groups in general. There's an interesting output-outcome framework for schemes section in the union budget, which profiles the outcomes of these budget allocations, the indicators and objectives that the allocations attempt to fulfill, and the target beneficiaries, which of course include women when we talk about gender budgeting. So a significant flaw in the GRB process in India is that some schemes that are reported in Part A of the expenditure document do not actually provide 100% of the budget allocation specifically for women. It's more of a overall target beneficiary that benefits women's advancement. However, additionally, a kind of double-edged sword is that sometimes when 100% of the scheme is a part A of the scheme is provided and 100% of the budget is provided to the scheme, this does little for actual gender equality and actually perpetuates unpaid care burden on women. For example, the LPG connection scheme, which is quite lauded and really goes far in reducing a lot of issues for women, especially in rural India. This regards women as 100% of the beneficiaries, but this also kind of perpetuates unpaid care burden and the view that women are supposed to be part of the household. So another implementation issue in the GRB process in India is that it only looks at which sex is the beneficiary of certain schemes and includes it within the budget document. And this can skew numbers. For example, if there has been a budget allocation for sensitizing male police officers, this should technically come under GRB, but it's missed due to the exclusion of women in the scheme itself. although India has amended its constitution and has made provisions for women's participation in decision making, like a one-third of the panchayat level government officials must be women, these provisions have only had some success due to a limited understanding of GRB and specifically gender-responsive decision making. The gender-responsive budgeting process does not have much of a role in actually determining the allocation of budgets. And the regulatory framework in India, as we see, shows that while there is an effort to quantify the extent of the budget that is allocated to women's advancement, there is little evidence of attempting to look at the gaps within the schemes itself in order to rectify the budgets in the planning process itself. So while the amount of funding allocated for women and gender budget audits by itself don't make a strong GRB process. So if we go to Bangladesh, in 2003, Bangladesh's finance ministry developed the Recurrent Capital Gender and Poverty Database, and the medium-term budget framework process, which was introduced, means that there is a medium-term outlook for budget planning. And in this, poverty, gender, and climate issues in particular were incorporated within the ministries to, quote, identify the impact or effect that each of the strategic objectives has on poverty reduction and women's advancement and rights. And the final document of the medium-term report has a table which includes and identifies gender-related expenditure. And by 2012, like in India, all ministries were brought under this process. And in Bangladesh, actually, each ministry prepares a gender budget report as opposed to an overall report during the union budget released. So these reports have detailed section on the ministry's relevant indicators concerning women's empowerment. And they also identify gender gaps in the ongoing activities and the obstacles to achieve their objectives. In particular, data on, quote, women's participation in ministries' activities and their share in total expenditures provided, which is important because it shows that Bangladesh has actually done work in providing data on how many women are actually involved in the gender-responsive decision-making process. Together with having laws mandating women's participation in decision-making, similar to India's, where 1/3 of all local government, which is the Union Parishad in Bangladesh's case, are women. Some of the issues in Bangladesh's GRB process is a lack of mandatory data disaggregation of beneficiaries in the overall documentation process. For example, the key performance indicators for ministries quote states that, this quote, these indicators can be gender segregated if sex disaggregated data is available. And if possible, at least 1 or 2 gender-specific indicators are identified for each ministry to indicate the level of performance. So this automatically would make the exercise a bit where anything that remotely fits in is just ticked and done away with. Also, a significant point to note is that in the 2020 national budget that was released, unlike previous years, this time Bangladesh did not publish a separate gender budget document. So maybe making the GRB exercise mandatory would be a way to hold the government accountable. In Rwanda, the GRB was introduced in 2003 by the Ministry of Gender and Family Promotion, as well as the UK's DFID, Department for International Development. But this suffered because there wasn't enough local support. So in 2009, the Ministry of Finance actually led it and also created a medium-term framework similar to Bangladesh. And since then, the gender budget statement has been prepared and released in Parliament every year. And 2 articles of the Rwanda's organic budget law actually state that all ministries and departments are required to prepare and submit this, and also have a follow-up to the gender budgeting statement plans where they must submit implementation reports as well. While we are now seeing that some similarities in some of these processes, what makes Rwanda stand out is that it's implemented legislation and auditing in the governance department itself. So the circulars in Rwanda actually call for budget agencies to report on factors like differences in civil service employment with respect to sex and level in the civil service. Additionally, the 2003 Constitution creates the basis for this reporting as it mandates that at least 30% of quota of women in all decision-making positions, not just the parliament, but every decision-making position, as well as the judiciary. So rather than simple reporting, Rwanda's budget statement actually directly contributes to the budget making and policy making process. And budgets are redirected in terms of where there is a shortage. In fact, Rwanda has also established a gender monitoring office, which is a separate entity to monitor all gender-related commitments across public, private, non-governmental, and religious institutions. So quickly to wrap up with some observations and recommendations, as we've noticed when we've done the comparisons, although India was the first to introduce the concept of GRB, it lags significantly behind the two countries in the GGI. And Rwanda ranks especially high in indicators like political empowerment, female labor force management, employment of women, share of seats, and total unemployment rate. And these indicators sort of show that gender responsive decision making as opposed to just budgeting is important because it enables the delivery of services to reach men and women equally. And a lot of these indicators show that Rwanda's process has really strengthened this. And India, on the other hand, has a framework that is limited to a gender budgeting statement. And it's limited in scope and doesn't actually affect budgetary allocations. The analysis does not, it's only when it doesn't influence the actual allocation of funds, and it's only when the activities are identified and approved post-design that the analysis takes place. For example, Indian ministries budget for a lot of schemes for creches and nursing homes, but there is no effort to actually collate infrastructure data in the beginning, which can provide an assessment of how much is actually required. The GRB process definitely needs to generate a link between the programming and funding, and we see that in the case of Rwanda, as well as a little bit in Bangladesh, because until then, a direct causal link can't really be made between the GRB framework and several of the gender equality indicators that we see. So finally, for the recommendations, we need to ensure that the budget call circulars are not just a routine form filling exercise, which we've seen. And if you go through the paper, you'll see exactly how much of a ticking exercise that it actually is. Because these reports should also account for gender-based impacts of raising revenue for the budgets and how these taxation policies have affected men and women differently. It is part of the global GRB exercise, but it's often neglected. And it also needs to be, as I said, it needs to be strengthened from merely being study of pre-approved projects to influencing allocation of funds. There needs to be better coordination between national, regional, and local GRB efforts, and local data needs to be incorporated into national budgets as well. And yeah, so finally, where the scope of GRB has been limited, there is no strong causal link between GRB processes and gender inequality indicators. But where it has been stronger, it is reflected in the indicators as well. And just to conclude, GRB is only one of the many tools that can provide gender justice and equality. Simply budgeting for schemes does not ensure justice. It must be made empirical and data-driven in order to analyze and create a causal link for how different sectors create funds and programs. And finally, of course, when we're talking about gender-responsive budgeting, of course, within this framework as well as this paper, it is talking about gender in a binary sense, which probably excludes a lot of people in the process as well, which is a point that must be looked into future discussions of gender-responsive budgeting. So that was a synopsis of the paper. I had to really condense this, but I hope everyone has a look at all the processes and details within the paper in order to get a broader idea of how I've presented it. Thanks. I'll just unshare.
Thank you, Aditi. That was very enlightening. I would like first to perhaps call on Shoumeli Das for her remarks. Shoumeli is a public finance consultant with UNICEF Maharashtra, who advises the Maharashtra government on the institutionalization of gender transformative financing. In other words, precisely one of the recommendations that Aditi has been talking about. She has co-developed the methodology framework for gender and child budgeting for the state and oversees its implementation through the Departments of Finance and Planning. And she formerly did have an association with us at ORF-Mumbai. Shoumeli, if you're there, perhaps you could go ahead.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you for having me as part of the panel. And it's always great to be back in discussion with ORF colleagues, and especially on a subject that is so dear to me. So I think I'm going to begin by actually congratulating Aditi on the paper. I think you had an enormous task at hand, and you've been able to do it brilliantly. Like, you've been able to synthesize very literature and data sources very well to give us some very sound observations on the way forward for gender budgeting, and I'm sure that must have been difficult, so congratulations, kudos, great job done there. I especially think there is a lot for us to learn from the experiences of Rwanda and Bangladesh, both being much smaller economies than ours, and yet showing us sort of leading the way in how to make development more inclusive, how to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, how to sort of, in the case of Bangladesh, establish thrust areas, poverty, climate, gender, all three areas, very important issues in the country right now. So I think there are great takeaways from the experiences, both at the policy making level as well as the implementation level. So I think some really important recommendations and observations coming in there. What I'd like to do with the rest of my time really is I'm going to divide it into two parts. And I'd like to make a few clarificatory remarks about the process of gender budgeting to begin with, sort of foundational, overarching remarks. And the second half, I think I'd like to talk about the main challenges that we face in the process of gender budgeting going forward. And this is all based on my experiences of working with UNICEF and UN Women in the Maharashtra government and institutionalizing gender and child budgeting. So I'll begin with the overarching sort of clarificatory points. And the first point that I'd really like to make is, I think we need to understand that gender budgeting is not the same as producing a gender budget statement. I think very often the two are conflated. And what I mean by that is just because a country or a state is producing a gender budget statement, that does not mean they are, so to say, doing gender budgeting. Gender budgeting is a much larger accountability mechanism, and the ecosystem involves many tools, one of which is the gender budget statement. So there are impact assessments, there are audits, there is engendering the budget speech, engendering the budget call circular. All of these are tools within that broad ambit of gender budgeting. But unfortunately, we have sort of been stuck at this one tool itself. The second sort of clarificatory remark that I'd like to make is that, and this is unfortunate for me to even admit to, but the fact that gender budgeting does not seem to be a priority for governments in India. And I'm going to say this, I'm going out on a limb to say this, but I say this on the basis of two things. First being that, look at our allocations for the gender budgets. I mean, it's abysmal. At the center, for example, out of what the 30 lakh crores that our budget was for last year, we have about 5% of that is our gender budget. And I'm not even getting into how this 5% was calculated, and we might argue that it's an overestimation or whatever it is. In Maharashtra, for example, out of our 4 lakh crores, we're only looking at a meager 1.8 to 2% of that budget being assigned to the gender budget. That is one reason. And the second is the process, like I said, has just not evolved. We've been fixated on the statement. We've been fixated on critiquing and criticizing and trying to improve the gender budget statement, and we've just not been able to move past that. And I think that makes our role as external stakeholders even more important, to come in and to help the government sort of prioritize this very important tool. The third point that I'd like to make, and you obviously have spoken about it in your presentation, is that in India, we're looking at only the expenditure side of the budget. We're not looking at the revenue side at all. And why that, obviously, it's part of the larger GRP framework. I think we're a while away from getting to looking at taxation policies and making them more gender responsive in the broader sense. I think that's a goal that's still far away. So with those three clarificatory remarks, really, I'll move on to what I think are the biggest challenges for gender budgeting and the future of gender budgeting in India specifically. And I think the first one that I'd like to point out is the issue of ownership. When we say gender budgeting needs to be done, I'm thinking, who is going to do gender budgeting? And I know that you refer in your paper to the role that NGOs and international organizations and civil society at large has played in, giving this process the very critical initial momentum that it needed. But I think it's fairly okay for me to say now that that's also made government slightly lackadaisical. Pretty much every state in India has some outside agency supporting the government, and I think for the process for gender budgeting to truly deepen and be sustainable in the long run, there has to be serious ownership coming in from the government, and then there's the question of who within the government. And external, experts will tell you that it should probably be the Department of Finance, the way it is the Ministry of Finance and the Department of Expenditure at the center. But for those of us who've interacted with governments, and I speak, based on the experiences of colleagues across states, we've all been told कि नहीं ये तो महिला बाल विकास का काम है, this is the job of the Women and Child Development Department, and that's concerning, not just because it shows the lack of political and administrative will, but also it shows the limited understanding of gender, and yet again we're back to thinking in terms of in silos, in terms of departments and schemes, and not moving beyond to think sectorally or as gender as a holistic issue. So I think the issue of ownership and the government owning it to further the process is definitely critical. The second point that I'd like to make is regarding the gender budget statement. Unfortunately, that's the only tool that we can really comment on, because it's the only tool that has really been institutionalized at large across the country. I do think that we've made the process extremely technocratic, right? And in our overemphasis on, asking for data and granular data, I think we've sort of moved away from the real goal of the process. And I'm going to caveat that immediately by saying that I am completely aware of the lack of data. Like, we don't have data on migrants, we don't have data on the informal sector, we don't have data on, gender disaggregated beneficiaries. Obviously, we're all aware of that. But here I'm saying, let's take a step back and let's work with estimates. Let's work with robust estimates. In Maharashtra, for example, we don't need data of the last beneficiary across 36 districts. It's okay to aggregate based on a couple of districts, to extrapolate and to come up with a credible estimate that can be reported into the statement. And we've done that for Maharashtra, for the Tribal Development Department, and it's worked out well, and it's been reported in the statement this year. Similarly, the whole segregation of Part A and Part B, and whether something needs to be in Part A or Part B, I think let's step back. We've critiqued that for 15 years now. Let's look beyond where it should appear on the statement, because while on the one hand we're the ones who say it needs to move beyond being an accounting exercise, we're the same people who still hanker for data and say the last beneficiary data is not available, things like that. I take your point about semantic exclusion, how initiatives that might be meant for men get left behind because the beneficiaries are male. And we've actually had to address that in Maharashtra, and we've made a section in the gender budget statement for qualitative reporting. And we got interesting responses there. So we have a scheme which is for sterilization of men, which is very much for gender equality, but couldn't make it to the main part of the statement. And there is space for departments to report it in Part B. So I think there are ways to work around it without making this framework extremely rigid. And only so we're able to move past it onto the other instruments. And I think I'm just going to make one final point, which is that in all of this, let's not forget why gender budgeting was initiated in the first place. The main point of it is to be able to address needs of women, girls, transgender persons, is to look at prioritizing their needs into the planning framework. Let's not forget the planning process. It's critical. And also budgeting. If we go back to Diane Nelson's 5-step framework, she begins with a situation analysis, and that is nowhere in the landscape of gender budgeting right now. She begins with situation analysis, goes into looking at whether schemes are addressing it, then on to adequacy of budgets, and finally into things like reporting and impact assessments and things like that. And that is the entire ecosystem of gender budgeting. And our role as external stakeholders is really that, to help the government understand needs, non-binary needs, intersectional needs, Where are the Dalit women? Where are farm widows? Where are the persons with disabilities? Where are their needs being represented and integrated into mainstream schemes? And also, very importantly, let's move beyond just addressing practical needs. I mean, the minute we come to women, we're stuck with reproductive health and school education. Let's do that. Let's also go beyond that to make it more transformative. skills development does not necessarily need to mean beauty parlor training and, cooking and stitching. It's all important, but I'm sure we can go beyond that. Like, if we put our minds together, there's no reason why we can't. And yeah, I think I'm going to end with that.
Thank you, Shoumeli. That was, I strongly agree with a lot of what you said, in particular the fact that we need to maybe broaden the scope of some of these interventions a bit. Before I introduce our next discussant, could I just let those of you who are watching know that if you want to ask questions, and we'll be turning to questions in about 10 to 15 minutes, if you want to ask questions, could you please type in your question in the message box on your screens. It'll be sent to me, and then I will put it to the panelists. So type in your question, please, with your name and affiliation, ideally, into the message box on the screen. The next discussant is Kadambari Shah, who is a senior associate at IDFC Institute in Bombay. Her research focuses on the ease of doing business in India, on special governance zones and urban governance, and she has a postgraduate degree in economics and finance from the Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics. Kadambari, please do go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to start by congratulating Aditi as well. I really enjoyed reading the paper on such an important topic, especially today. And I echo what Shoumeli said as well about learning so much from Bangladesh and Rwanda for the Indian example. I particularly was struck by the thought that was put into in terms of Bangladesh, where they actually identified not only the gaps but the obstacles to achieve to close those gaps. And I think there's a lot that India can learn from that example as well. I'd like to make three points. One is on the, and these are going to be more from the policy angle. So one is on the decision-making process for the GRB, and I think that what we do is that while we have got all of these new quotas, these new mandates to increase the number of women in the political sphere, there's also, I think, a need to talk to people and women who are being impacted by these decisions. So it's not just having more women making the decisions, but also interacting with those who are going to be affected by them. And I think that's one part where we don't do as good a job. So, for example, when planning the budgets, is there a way to speak to women to see what their needs are, to see where they are struggling, and then actually allocate the funds and schemes to actually bridge those gaps? So that would be one thing. And then the other one is also in terms of to not make it just a tick boxing exercise. So how do we actually just essentially have some sort of outcome measurement along with the funds? And of course, there are lots of state capacity issues in India, and a capacity constrained environment like ours. You've already touched upon some of the manifestations of that in your recommendations. So to increase coordination, to increase the availability of data. And of course, these are much larger issues that need to be solved, but they go a long way in not just creating better governance, but also targeting that governance for women. Another just a broad point that I'd like to make is that I was very intrigued by one line in your paper where you spoke about how, in terms of the indices, where it's, even though India seems to have achieved a higher level of education for its girls, they aren't translating into employment opportunities and jobs. And that's something that intrigues me, because traditional research says that higher levels of education are actually correlated with employment. And it's in one of the explanations in terms of the socio-cultural explanations is that that the value of education has actually gone up in the marriage market, and everyone wants an educated girl. So the cost of that education now is a lot cheaper than the dowry that one would have to pay if the girl was not educated, which is one potential explanation, but such elements would need to be addressed as well. And I think the gender responsive budgeting is going to become an even more important part of the next couple of years. I think, Mihir, you had a tweet on this recently where we essentially have until 2036, in the next 15 years, to actually capitalize on our demographic dividend and to actually use our young population before it becomes an aging one. And girls and women will play a large role in that process. And we don't know what the impacts of COVID are going to be, but it might exacerbate the problem, which is why the gender responsive budgeting would, of course, along with several other factors that both Aditi and Shoumeli mentioned, but if that could play a greater role, then we could use the opportunity of this young population and actually use it to do something that would benefit the country to actually grow into a middle-class nation and establish itself as one. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kadambari. As I said, if you have any questions, could you please type them into the message box on your app? But if nobody minds, I will set the ball rolling with a couple of questions, which will, they're addressed to Aditi, but they can subsequently, comments from any of the discussants would be very welcome. And that is that for those of us who are more familiar with the process as it is done in India, which is, the gender outcome budget, it examines very clear, sort of broadly what the schemes are that could conceivably have, as you have listed in your paper, some impact on women. Could you explain to us, Aditi, or maybe Shoumeli could also speak about this? How does it work on the revenue side? How does gender response budgeting work when it comes to taxation? Because I don't think that's clear to many of us who have just the Indian experience.
So I'm sure Shoumeli will agree with as well. That is what is lacking in the GRB process in the country. Unfortunately, the process as it stands is the gender budgeting statement of allocations when it comes to schemes and funding for different schemes. We have not reached the process where we are creating reports that assess the impacts of revenue generation on men and women differently. So that is a step that is essential that we take. Of course, there have been developments like in 2018, removing taxation on sanitary pads, etc. So those steps have been taken, very welcome steps. But again, there hasn't been a holistic framework where we have tried to see which taxation policy that we have in place today affect who separately. So I think states and local governments and of course national ministries and committees need to work together in consolidating this and creating I know Shoumeli said that we're getting too technical, but I think we do need this data, and we do need to see which, not just men and women, but the transgender community, the LGBT community at large, and create this bank of gender disaggregated data on exactly which taxation policies affect which person. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have to be restricted to gender-based data, but every vulnerable group there is, which doesn't exist now, unfortunately. And global GRB policies dictate that it should. So if we've made these international commitments in several summits and committees, then I think we should definitely adhere to it, and that's the way forward. Shoumeli, if you have any.
No, I think you summarized it. Unfortunately, like if I were to be completely honest, there has been no work on the revenue side. Nothing that I have done for sure, because it's only been with budgets. So I can definitely not speak from experience. It's only what we've read in literature. And it's of course looking at our indirect taxation system, so things like sanitary napkins, but I'm sure if we can think a little more of what else deserves tax concessions, so that. And secondly, in looking at income tax, personal income tax as well, to understand who are the most vulnerable women who probably need a tax break more than others. So feeding into something that Aditi said about understanding how our taxation actually affects men and women differently. So again, it has to begin with that needs analysis and then move down to what we can do to help women sort of set up businesses, what kind of entrepreneurial breaks tax breaks can be given to them, things like that. And yeah, I mean, the point was not to say that, we don't need to get more technical. It is a technical exercise, but I feel like it's paralyzing the process. And we might as well work with what we have, I think, in response to your point, Aditi. So yeah, I think we're all on the same page, but I'm just saying let's be like, yeah, let's not aim for the stars just yet.
Thank you. We've got a question that's come in from Avadut Abhyankar. And Avadut asks how gender budgeting could be made more participatory and deliberative, particularly at the municipal level. So what are the processes maybe that we can put into place to enable it to be more inclusive? Aditi, perhaps you could take that.
Yeah, that's a great question because so municipal budgets do release gender budget statements as well. Like the Mumbai Municipal Corporation does release a gender budget statement every year along with its municipal budget. A lot of it is currently to do with capacity building initiatives, etc. And again, it's a routine exercise where an overall feel of how much of the budget is allocated to women's development initiatives, etc. It's not very. It doesn't have a lot of data involved in it. It's a budget form filling exercise at the moment. What I felt where gender responsive budgeting can really make a dent here is if we involve gender mapping civic amenities itself. So municipal corporations, have are institutions that provide your lights, that provide your public toilets, that provide your safe walkways. All these have an effect on men and women differently. Lights affect safety. There is safety mapping that can be incorporated into gender budgets to see which areas require more lighting in order to make women feel safer. Public toilets is a huge issue. The Praja Foundation had a really great report on how many public toilets per square feet, not square feet, per certain 5-kilometer radius exist for men and women. And public toilets for women was significantly lesser and not in areas that correlated with a larger number of women. So that kind of mapping needs to be done to see which areas have the demographic of certain areas, and then providing civic amenities for those areas based on the demographic of men and women in the area. So I think these budgets need to include these issues so that we can make a more holistic version of a gender budget as opposed to just how much money is allocated.
Shoumeli, I'm sure that you have a great deal to say on this.
Well, not a great deal, but I'll just add to what Aditi has already sort of put out there, where I think first step is to make women, as Kadambari said, make them part of the process of planning and budgeting, like get more women involved in the process. And both at the union level and at the state level, at the municipal level, at the Gram Panchayat level, pre-budget consultations in a way are always advocated as having civil society stakeholders come in and sort of talk about the needs of women and children at large. And in fact, in Maharashtra, we have, the system of the Mahila Sabha actually meeting before every Gram Panchayat meeting to put forth their requirements and their needs to the Gram Sabha. So I think that's a very sort of a helpful and a very good precedent for others to follow in as well. And that can definitely deepen the process of gender, let's say gender planning and budgeting at the localist levels. So yeah.
Can I quickly jump in again? Yeah. So one thing that I realized while researching the Bangladesh and Rwanda process is that what both Kadambari and Shoumeli said, they really map how many women are in the decision-making process. That's part of their gender responsive budgeting process, where even if it's like a form that they take, they talk about how many women are actually part of the decision-making process, which I think we need to inculcate and learn from them in our different levels as well.
Great. Well, thank you. And you're right. This is definitely something that I can imagine would be very useful to implement, though I'm sure there'd be a lot of objections as well. The question that I think I've got now coming in is, I think, complicates the question just a little bit, which is, and it's from Ms. Kamachi from Social Watch Tamil Nadu, and she asks, how can the GRB process be enabled to empower the most marginalized women in a particular territory? So SC women, ST women, disabled women, the elderly, transgenders. So she's asking essentially about intersectionality in the process. How can that be introduced? Or what are the mechanisms maybe that we have to look at as examples?
So I can start off and then Kadambari and Shoumeli can follow. So that's a great question, because as I said, one of the limitations of this paper and the GRB framework is that it's limited to gender, talking about gender in a binary lens, and it needs to be more inclusive for sure. And when we're talking about participation, participatory decision making, collecting data for impact, it definitely needs to be more inclusive, and it is not right now, which is why even research for these areas is limited. So broadening the scope of gender, talking about gender responsive budgeting is essential. It's the first step, and the second step is kind of working together with the institutions that work for women and child and for different marginalized communities. There needs to be better coordination between them, better data generation to see which beneficiaries require more in these areas to report for it, and then include that in the decision-making process, together with participation of all these communities, which do exist, but kind of to extend it from merely a quota level participation to actual empowerment and decision-making roles.
Can I come in? Yeah, so I think two things, one of which you've mentioned, Aditi. Let's find out where the needs lie. Let's find out, let's not decide for them. Let's ask, these absolutely marginalized women what the requirements are. And the second thing is, if I were to think like the government and think in terms of schemes, let's not only try to come up with a separate scheme for people with disabilities, a separate scheme for tribal women. Let's integrate it into our scheme. So let's have components within major schemes. So if we have a scheme for, let's say, maternity benefits, let's have a component there saying, if you are a woman from a marginalized community or with a disability, the benefit you get is slightly more, or you get it differently. You get 4 installments instead of 3, something like that. So I think there is a way to bring in responsiveness into all our schemes as they exist today. They don't need to be separate schemes. We're trying to actually move away, because the 100% category, so to say, in the gender budget is a very tiny minuscule percentage of your entire state budget, and we want to focus away from that into the remaining part of the budget to see how we can make that more responsive. So yeah, those would be my inputs.
And I think the coordination, like you said, because there's a lot of replication and leaking resources because there's so much confusion between the coordination. So I think working together and creating those, like you said, interrelated schemes is very beneficial, definitely.
Yeah.
Kadambari, do you have? Yeah, please.
Yeah. No, I was just going to echo what both Aditi and Shoumeli have said, that it's also, here is where, especially what Aditi said about coordination, because this is where I think synthesizing different efforts, because currently so much work happens in silos without departments knowing what is happening, even sometimes across up and down different floors, that actually synthesizing these efforts and improving the coordination among government agencies. And I think data also plays a huge role in this, because then you're dealing with objective metrics rather than different reports that may be on pen and paper. So yeah, I would say the coordination element in data would be key here.
So I actually want to then take off from what Kadambari just said about this, about how it involves maybe a re-examination of how government talks to itself, to repeat a question that Saili, I presume, from ORF-Mumbai has asked, and she's asking, how do you think that government capacity building towards gender budgeting could happen, reducing the dependence that we currently have on external agencies? So if anyone wants to take that.
I think Shoumeli would be the perfect person to answer that because she actually does this. So go ahead.
So I think the models that we work on and I can speak on behalf of UNICEF, when I think we try to keep the engagement that we have and the capacity building process to be a sustained process and to be a continuous process rather than something that's restricted to a workshop or a training, right? Very often when we say capacity building, we're calling it capacity building, we're actually thinking trainings, right? But when I spoke about in the gender budget making, in the budget statement making process, when I'm trying to engage with departments to see that if they want to insist that the Awas Yojana should be in part A, I argue with them, I try to convince them, but in the process, I'm also sensitizing them. So when sort of I exist as a consultant from supporting the process in the government, I've still sort of given these middle and lower rung officials really. We're not even, these conversations are not happening with the IAS officers who are obviously a lot more receptive to all of this. So we leave the middle and lower rung in a much better position to ask these questions to themselves and also to come up with, the correct answers, so to say, as we would want a progressive budgeting and planning processes to be like. So I think sustained engagement, to have the patience to go into it with the approach of sustained engagement is I cannot stress enough on how important that is.
Does anybody, either of the Aditi or Kadambari, anything to add to that?
No, I completely agree with Shoumeli. I've been to one of these workshops where a lot of high-level discussion was happening. Different states were given their perspectives, and a lot of high-level officers were talking about how they are mainstreaming capacity building initiatives. But then when you actually again, as she rightly said, when you get down to the people who are taking care of the papers or filling in the forms, they have to be sensitized to exactly what they're filling in and how what they're filling in is affecting people as well. So it's every tier, every single person that these large workshops and trainings need to happen for, as opposed to just high-level discussions that we already always have.
We're running a little short on time, but so I don't think that Aditi will be able to answer the other questions I'm reading out. But I want to sort of flag it because there is interest, in particular, from Sarojini Thakur on the tools, the specific tools that are being used in Rwanda. But we have about 5 minutes left, and what I would appreciate it is if we did one little round, Shoumeli first, then Kadambari, and ending with Aditi, just sort of a summary on your takeaways, perhaps, that we should be thinking about.
Right. So I think the one thing that I'd like to sort of state as my final takeaway is that let's go back to understanding what gender needs are, regionally what gender needs are, at the local level what gender needs are, and let's respond to that instead of thinking schematically, instead of thinking that these are the schemes that we have and this is what we work with, so let's just sort of put these into buckets. That's not what the process of gender budgeting is about, and let's focus on planning and prioritization. I think those would be my final sort of takeaways.
Kadambari?
Yeah, to completely echo what Shoumeli just said, but also to I also like what she mentioned earlier, is to actually just go back to the why. Why are we doing this, and start from there as well, because sometimes going back and looking at things with a different perspective can actually create better solutions, better ideas, and to take it forward from there, because it's clear that gender issues are going to become even more important in the next couple of years. And to solve them, we need the GRB. We need all the other elements that are working along with GRB to achieve this. And I think not forgetting the why is going to carry us a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I've been saying, I truly believe that the gender responsive budgeting process must be linked with the gender responsive decision making process. Actual participation, empowered participation as opposed to just lip service, in order to ensure that the funds are distributed effectively to vulnerable groups. And it must be more empirical and data driven in order to actually analyze and create any kind of causal link for how different sectors create funds and programs, both in terms of revenue generation and budget allocations, and implement them that affects the overall country's gender equality indicators that we love seeing and mentioning. So starting from the local and then, going to these international summits and making our claims.
Thank you very much, Aditi. Thank you, Kadambari, and in fact, thank you, Shoumeli. Thank you, all of you, for this discussion. That if I were to summarize my takeaways, I think that, or what I've learned, I think first that the gender budgeting process in India, as it operates, is limited in certain respects. It's particularly limited in that it does not have a sufficiently consultative, inclusive, it's not produced through a sufficiently inclusive process. It is limited in that it may not have give enough consideration to intersectional questions, and it is limited in that the specific items that are included and not included may not precisely be always correct. And it is limited again in that it looks at only one side of the government's activities and not at the other. And finally, it's limited in that the unlike, for example, in Rwanda, you do not, in fact, understand what the gender composition is of the people who produce it. And I think that that can make a big difference. Thanks again to all three of you. Thanks to all of those who asked questions and all of those who tuned in. We hope we'll see you again at ORF Fellow Seminar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mihir. Thanks, everyone.